My brother-in-law laughed when my dad got sick, so I made sure he lost his job and his marriage. My father, Augustin, had been diagnosed with stage 3 pancreatic cancer on a Tuesday in March. He'd been 64 years old. He'd been told he had 6 to 12 months to live. The whole family had been gathering at my parents' house that Sunday for what was supposed to be a planned family update meeting. My older sister Persephone had been there with her husband Reginald. My younger brother Caspian had been there with his wife Bellatrix. My husband Theron and I had been there. My father had been telling us. The news had been devastating. My mother had been crying. My sister had been crying. My brother had been crying. I'd been crying. My husband had been crying. My brother-in-law Reginald had been laughing. The thing about Reginald is that he'd been an awful man. He'd been 36. He'd been a successful executive at a tech company. He'd been making $400,000 a year. He'd been a narcissist. He'd been the kind of person who'd been making jokes at funerals. The laugh had been audible. It had been a real laugh. My father had been looking at him. He'd been hurt. He'd been saying, "Reginald, is something funny?" Reginald had been trying to compose himself. He'd been saying, "No, Augustin, I'm sorry. I couldn't help it. The way you were talking about it, it was so dramatic. I just had to laugh." The room had been silent. Reginald had been continuing. He'd been saying, "I mean, it's not great news, but it's not the end of the world. People beat cancer all the time. You'll be fine. Don't make it bigger than it needs to be." My father had been speechless. My mother had been speechless. The meeting had been ending awkwardly. My sister Persephone had been driving home with Reginald. She'd been crying. He'd been telling her she was being too sensitive. I'd been calling my sister that night. I'd been telling her I'd been wanting to do something. She'd been telling me, "Octavia, he'd been being a jerk, but he's my husband. I can't do anything about it." "Persephone, you don't have to. I will." "Octavia, what are you going to do?" "Whatever is necessary." Persephone had been silent. She'd been not arguing with me. I'd been a federal investigator. I'd been an FBI agent for 8 years. I'd been having access to resources most people wouldn't have. I'd been being very, very capable of making someone's life difficult. The plan had been to investigate Reginald quietly. The investigation had been finding things. Reginald had been embezzling from his own company. He'd been moving money to a personal account. He'd been doing it for the past 2 years. The amounts had been being approximately $10,000 a month. The total amount embezzled had been approximately $240,000. The investigation had been also finding something else. Reginald had been having an affair with his executive assistant. They'd been meeting at hotels. They'd been having photos together. The affair had been going on for 8 months. The first step had been the company. I'd been anonymously sending the embezzlement evidence to Reginald's company's HR department. I'd been being thorough. I'd been making it impossible to ignore. The company had been firing Reginald immediately. They'd been pursuing criminal charges. He'd been being unable to find a comparable position. He'd been making $120,000 instead of $400,000. The next step had been my sister. I'd been calling her on a Saturday afternoon. I'd been showing her the affair evidence, the photos, the hotel receipts, the text messages. Persephone had been silent. She'd been crying. She'd been telling me she'd been kind of knowing something was wrong. She'd been telling me she'd been ignoring it. Persephone had been thinking about it for a week. She'd been calling me. She'd been telling me she'd been wanting to talk to a divorce lawyer. I'd been recommending an excellent divorce lawyer. He'd been a friend of mine from work. He'd been having handled difficult divorces involving infidelity. The divorce had been being filed 3 months later. Persephone had been being smart. She'd been being well-positioned. She'd been being able to keep their house. The divorce had been being granted within 8 months. Reginald had been being financially devastated. He'd been being emotionally devastated. All of this had been happening while my father had been getting weaker. My father had been being on hospice. My father had been being told everything that had been happening with Reginald. My father had been being thrilled. He'd been being telling me how proud he was of me. But on his deathbed, my father had been calling me close. He'd been being weak. He'd been being telling me he'd been needing to tell me something. He'd been being telling me Reginald had been not just been a jerk. He'd been being telling me he'd been having figured out something about Reginald years ago. He'd been being telling me he'd been having gathered evidence. He'd been being telling me he'd been having a folder. He'd been being telling me to look in his desk after he died. He'd been being telling me the folder had been having information that would put Reginald in prison for the rest of his life. My father had been passing away 3 days later. He'd been going quietly. He'd been going in his sleep. I'd been getting the call at 4 in the morning. Theron had been answering the phone first. He'd been holding me while I'd been crying. I'd been the one who had been needing to hold everything together. That's just how it had been working in our family. I'd been calling the funeral home. I'd been calling Persephone. I'd been calling Caspian. I'd been sitting with my mother Liv for hours while she'd been staring at the wall. Theron had been staying close to me the whole time. He'd been sitting next to me on the couch one night while I'd been going through paperwork, and he'd been putting his hand on my shoulder and saying, "You don't have to be strong for everyone right now." I'd been looking at him. I'd been telling him, "I promised my dad I'd find that folder. That's what's keeping me standing." The funeral had been small. It had been private, just family. We'd been having it at a little chapel near my parents' house. Caspian had been getting up to speak. He'd been clearing his throat and looking down at a piece of paper he'd been holding with shaking hands. He'd been saying, "My father was the strongest man I ever knew. He never raised his voice. He never made a scene. He just showed up every single day and made sure we were okay." Then it had been my turn. I'd been walking up to the front. I'd been saying, "My dad never raised his voice. Not once in my whole life. He didn't need to. When he spoke, you listened, because everything he said had been worth hearing. He was a man of quiet dignity. He made sure, every single day, that his family was protected, even when we didn't know we needed protecting. That's who Augustin Barfield was, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be half as strong as he was." After the funeral, the family had been gathering back at my parents' house. We'd been all sitting in the living room, the same living room where my father had been telling us about his diagnosis all those months ago. And then the front door had been opening. Nobody had been knocking. The door had just been opening, and Reginald had been standing there. He'd been looking bad. His clothes had been wrinkled. His hair had been messy. His eyes had been red and glassy. He'd been drinking. You could smell it from across the room. He'd been stepping inside and saying, "I have a right to be here. I was family for 7 years." The room had been going completely still. Persephone had been freezing. Caspian had been standing up immediately. He'd been getting between Reginald and the rest of us. He'd been saying, "You need to leave, now." Reginald had been ignoring him completely. completely. He'd been looking directly at me. He'd been saying, "You did this to me. You think I don't know? You're the reason I lost everything." I'd been staying calm. I'd been looking right back at him and saying, "You lost everything because of what you did, not because of me." Reginald had been laughing. It had been a bitter, ugly laugh. He'd been saying, "Your father would be ashamed of you." The room had been going dead silent. And then my mother had been standing up. Liv had been setting down the photo of Augustine gently on the chair. She'd been walking across the room slowly. She'd been being 62 years old. She'd been being a woman who had just buried her husband. But she'd been walking right up to Reginald and looking up at him and saying, "My husband's last words about you were that you deserved everything coming to you. Get out of my house." Her voice had been steady. It had been the most words she'd been saying all day. Reginald's face had been crumbling. He'd been turning around. He'd been walking out the door. After he'd been leaving, I'd been waiting until the house had been calming down. I'd been waiting until Theron had been helping leave to bed. And then I'd been going to my father's study alone. The room had been smelling like him, like old books and coffee and that aftershave he'd been wearing for 40 years. I'd been sitting down at his desk. I'd been opening the top drawer. Nothing. I'd been opening the second drawer. Papers, bills, normal stuff. I'd been opening the bottom drawer. And there it had been. A thick folder. A brown folder with a rubber band around it. It had been labeled on the front in my father's handwriting. Reginald Barfield. My hands had been shaking. I'd been opening the folder. The first page had been a handwritten note. My father's handwriting. The note had been saying, "I didn't want you to have to carry this alone. But if you're reading this, it means I couldn't carry it anymore either. Be careful with what you find. Some of it involves people we love." I'd been not sleeping that night. I'd been taking the folder to the kitchen table. Theron had been still awake. He'd been pulling out a chair and sitting down next to me without saying a word. What I'd been finding in that folder had been so much worse than I'd been expecting. Reginald had been running a completely separate fraud scheme years before the embezzlement I'd been uncovering. This had been at a previous company he'd been working at before he'd even been married to Persephone. He'd been falsifying contracts. He'd been forging signatures on documents. He'd been setting up shell accounts and funneling payments into them. And my father had been the one who had been finding it. My father had been stumbling onto this whole thing when he'd been helping Persephone with some financial paperwork before the wedding. My father had been the kind of person who'd been reading every line of every document. He'd been noticing things, inconsistencies, numbers that hadn't been adding up. My father had been investigating on his own. He'd been gathering bank statements. He'd been collecting copies of the forged documents. He'd been building a case against Reginald without anyone knowing. And then there had been a section in the folder that had been making my blood go cold. My father had been writing a detailed account of a private conversation he'd been having with Reginald. It had been dated years before the cancer diagnosis. My father had been confronting Reginald alone. He'd been telling Reginald he'd been knowing about the fraud. My father had been writing down Reginald's exact words. Reginald had been saying, "If you say a word, I'll make Persephone's life miserable. You'll never see your grandchildren. I'll turn her against you." That had been what Reginald had been saying to my dying father, to the man who had been walking Persephone down the aisle. And my father had been backing down, not because he'd been scared, because he'd been protecting Persephone. He'd been choosing his daughter's happiness over justice. He'd been swallowing that poison and carrying it inside him for years. I'd been putting the papers down. My hands had been shaking. Theron had been sitting next to me the whole time, reading along. I'd been looking at him and saying, "My dad carried this for years. He let that man sit at our table, laugh at our holidays, and he said nothing because he was protecting Persephone." Theron had been looking at me and saying, "And now he's asking you to finish it." But the note had been saying something else too. Some of it involves people we love. I'd been turning to the last section, and that had been where everything had been getting complicated. The last section of the folder had been having documents about a business loan, a loan that Reginald had been taking out years ago. He'd been convincing Persephone to co-sign on it. The property that had been being used as collateral had been connected to my parents' assets. Reginald had been setting it up in a way that had been burying the details. He'd been putting papers in front of Persephone and she'd been signing them because she'd been trusting her husband. And now, if Reginald's earlier fraud got exposed, if that loan defaulted because of it, Persephone could be held financially responsible. My sister, the person I'd been trying to protect this whole time, she could be the one who'd been getting hurt by this. I'd been sitting back in my chair. I'd been realizing I couldn't just take this folder and hand it over to the authorities. Not yet. Not without figuring out how to keep Persephone safe first. It had been 2 a.m. I'd been calling Sage. Sage had been my best friend since college. She'd been a financial consultant. I'd been explaining the situation to her carefully. I'd been not sharing Reginald's name. I'd been just laying out the financial picture. Sage had been saying, "Okay, listen to me carefully. If your sister's name is on those documents, you need to get her legally separated from that loan before anything else happens. Once charges are filed, creditors move fast. You need to get her off that paper first." I'd been asking, "How fast are we talking?" Sage had been saying, "Days, maybe a week or 2 if you're lucky. If your sister's name is still on that loan when that happens, she could lose everything she just got in her divorce." I'd been setting up a meeting the very next day. I'd been calling the divorce lawyer who had been handling Persephone's case. We'd been meeting at his office that afternoon. Persephone had been sitting next to me in the waiting room, not knowing what this had been about. When we'd been sitting down in the lawyer's office, I'd been looking at my sister and saying, "I found something in Dad's desk. Dad left it for me. There are things about Reginald we didn't know." Persephone's face had been going pale. She'd been looking at me and asking, "How bad?" I'd been explaining the co-signed loan to her. I'd been keeping it simple. I'd been telling her that if certain things came to light about Reginald's past, that loan could default, and Persephone could be the one left holding the bill. Persephone had been sitting there for a long time. She hadn't been saying anything. Then she'd been looking up and her eyes had been wet and she'd been saying, "I trusted him with everything. I signed things he put in front of me. I was so stupid." I'd been reaching over and grabbing her hand. I'd been saying, "You weren't stupid. You were married to a con artist. That's not the same thing." The lawyer had been already looking through some of the documents. He'd been saying, "The loan is still active. Your name is still on it. But you can petition to have your name removed. We'd need to prove you were misled about the nature of the agreement. Based on what I'm seeing here, that's doable." Persephone had been letting out a breath. The lawyer had been saying, "But we need to move before anyone else discovers these documents exist. If Reginald Reginald finds out there's a folder with all of this, he could try to destroy evidence or flee. We'd been leaving his office with a plan. While all of this had been happening, Reginald had been falling apart. I'd been getting a call from Caspian 2 days later. He'd been saying, Reginald called me last night. He was drunk. He was rambling. He said he knows someone in the family is out to get him. He said he's going to find proof and make everyone pay. I'd been telling Caspian, don't engage with him. Don't answer his calls. Days had been passing. I'd been checking my phone every hour. I'd been waiting for the lawyer to call. And then one morning my phone had been ringing. It had been Persephone. Her voice had been shaking. She'd been saying, he just called me. He said he wants to talk things through. He said he knows about the desk. He said, your father thought he was smart, but he should have destroyed that folder when he had the chance. I'd been going cold. Reginald had been knowing about the folder. He'd been either overhearing something at the funeral gathering when he'd been showing up uninvited, or he'd been watching the house. The timeline had just been getting a whole lot shorter. I'd been telling Persephone to stay calm. I'd been telling her not to call Reginald back. I'd been telling her to stay at the house with Liv and not go anywhere alone. Then I'd been walking into the bedroom where Theron had been getting ready for work. He'd been looking at my face and he'd been stopping what he'd been doing. He'd been saying, what happened? I'd been saying, I can't wait for the petition to go through. I need to get this evidence to the right people now before Reginald does something desperate. Theron had been saying, what about Persephone? I'd been saying, the lawyer says even if the petition isn't finalized, the fact that it's been filed gives Persephone legal standing to argue she was acting in good faith. I'd been calling Sage one more time. Sage had been saying, it's not zero risk, but waiting is worse. If he destroys that evidence, your sister has nothing. You move now. I'd been hanging up. I'd been looking at the folder sitting on our dresser, my father's handwriting on the front. I'd been thinking about my father sitting alone in his study, carrying this weight, choosing silence to protect his daughter. He'd been carrying it until his body gave out. He'd been passing it to me because he'd been trusting me to do what he couldn't. I wasn't going to let him down. I'd been driving to the bureau that morning with the folder on the passenger seat. I'd been walking into the building I'd been working in for 8 years. I'd been finding a colleague I'd been trusting. He'd been a senior agent. I'd been sitting down across from him in his office, and I'd been putting the folder on his desk. I'd been being honest. I'd been saying, this is personal, my brother-in-law, but the evidence is real, and it involves financial crimes across 2 companies and multiple years. I'm not asking for a favor. I'm asking you to look at what's here and decide if it warrants action. He'd been spending almost an hour going through everything. Then he'd been closing the folder and looking at me and saying, this isn't small. This is federal wire fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. The embezzlement your sister's company already caught is the tip of the iceberg. He'd been agreeing to open a formal referral. 3 days later, Reginald had been contacted by federal investigators, and he'd been losing it. He'd been calling Persephone. He'd been screaming through the phone. He'd been yelling, you did this. You and your sister. Your whole family is trying to destroy me. Persephone had been ready though. Her lawyer had been coaching her. She'd been saying one thing and one thing only. She'd been saying, I have nothing to say to you. Contact my attorney. She'd been calling me right after. Her voice had been shaking. She'd been saying, I did it. I didn't break. I'd been saying, I'm proud of you. Dad would be proud of you. Reginald hadn't been done. He'd been trying to get to me directly. He'd been showing up at my house. Theron had been answering the door. Reginald had been standing on our front step looking like a man who hadn't been sleeping in days. He'd been saying, I need to talk to your wife. She has to stop this. She has no idea what she's doing. Theron had been standing in that doorway, calm and solid, and he'd been saying, she knows exactly what she's doing, and you need to leave before I call the police. Reginald hadn't been leaving, so Theron had been closing the door. He'd been locking it. He'd been calling the police. They'd been coming and escorting Reginald away with a warning. Then the call had been coming from the lawyer. He'd been saying, she's clear. Whatever happens to Reginald now, your sister is protected. The petition separating Persephone from the loan had been granted. I'd been standing in my kitchen when I'd been hearing those words, and I'd been breathing out in a way that had been feeling like the first real breath I'd been taking in months. 2 weeks later, Reginald had been formally indicted on multiple federal charges: wire fraud, forgery, embezzlement. He'd been facing up to 20 years. I hadn't been celebrating. I'd been getting in my car and driving to the cemetery. I'd been sitting down on the grass next to my father's grave. The ground had been cold. The sky had been gray. I'd been sitting there for a long time not saying anything. Then I'd been talking out loud. I'd been saying, I found the folder, Dad. I took care of it. Persephone is safe. Mom is safe. We're all going to be okay. I'd been stopping. I'd been looking at his name on the stone. I'd been saying, I wish you'd told me sooner. I wish you hadn't carried it alone. In the months after, Persephone had been moving back into the family home with Liv. They'd been taking care of each other. Persephone had been starting therapy. One evening she'd been calling me and we'd been talking for a long time, and she'd been saying, I keep thinking about how Dad sat across from Reginald at every holiday, knowing what he knew and never once let it show. He did that for me. I'd been quiet for a second, then I'd been saying, he did everything for us. Reginald had been accepting a plea deal. He'd been getting 8 years. I hadn't